Hi, Lorri. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
We're going to be talking about concepts today, one of our favorite topics. And we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which we come to you. For me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
And I'm from Wanneroo lands in the Hunter Valley.
And we'd like to pay our respects to their elders past and present. And we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that might be joining us for this podcast.
And also the elders of the future, those students that are in our classrooms at the moment. Welcome, everybody. Today we'll be discussing English concepts that Michael just mentioned to you. We're going to talk about what they are, what evidence there is to support them, and why they're important. So let's start with the first big question. What are concepts, Michael?
Well, Lorri, I like to use my iceberg analogy to explain what concepts are. Think of a text as an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is what we see above the water. But just like the topic of the text, this is just the bit which we can obviously see. But what lurks beneath the surface of that text or that iceberg is, of course, the theme. And this is what we find by that closer investigation of the text. So where is the concept in this picture? To my mind, the concept is actually in the ocean that surrounds the iceberg. And in fact, we have many icebergs that are sitting in this ocean, different texts that are looking at that concept in different ways. And the concept, of course, is something big and dynamic. It changes according to perspective. It's a much bigger idea than simply theme.
I like your analogies, Michael, and particularly this one because I understand it now. I've noticed that a lot of well-meaning primary teachers take a thematic approach to the teaching of English, and that's fine, but they teach themes like bushrangers, gold, rainforest, we've all heard of these, but these are not English concepts, are they?
No, they're not. And, you know, really, they're probably more to do with science and HSIE than they are with English.
That's right.
And I think that's an unfortunate approach because it's losing that focus on English as a subject. So, you know, we don't want English to be reduced to simply a set of literacy skills. I think that's the danger there. So English, of course, like all subjects, has its big ideas. It's just that in the previous 2012 syllabus, of course, that wasn't very obvious to find.
That's true. But all subjects have concepts, don't they? The New South Wales geography concept syllabus, for example, identifies the concepts of place, space, environment, interconnection, scale, sustainability, and change.
That's right. And the history syllabus includes the concepts of continuity and change, cause and effect, perspective, empathetic understanding, and significance.
Both of these subjects are very clear, but where are the concepts in English, Michael? The Australian Curriculum English 2022 includes a section on key ideas, which is important. It has an outcome now, understanding and responding to literature, and that's where the concepts live.
Yes, and look, you know, as you know, we have a new curriculum in New South Wales now, which actually tells us exactly what the concepts we need to be looking at. And that's been a really important breakthrough, hasn't it?
That's right. And here's the K2 syllabus, understanding and responding to literature outcome. And these are the concepts in kindergarten: context, narrative, character, imagery, symbol and connotation, perspective. Stage 1, there are 2, 4, 6, there's one more, and that is representation. And we've linked them to you for the presentation here if people want to find them, but you can find them yourself easily enough. What about 3, 6, Michael? What are the concepts there?
Here we have 3 to 6, and you can see we've got argument and authority as an additional concept, and also theme and genre. Perspective and context. If we just go back to the previous slide, Lorri, you can see we have perspective and argument before, and context was a separate concept for stage 1. But going back to stage 2 now, the next slide, you can see that perspective has been linked with context, and we've got argument linked with authority. So Authority is certainly new, theme is new, and genre is new in stage 2 and 3. And character, you can see, has changed from character to characterization. So it's not so much about looking at characters and in a sort of an obvious way. By the time we get to stage 2, we're looking at the process by which characters are developed by composers.
I'm noticing there are some gaps here, Michael. I'm used to some concepts in certain stages and they're not there. I'm just wondering about that. What happens if it's not in the curriculum, but there's a concept that's in the text that you're teaching?
Well, look, yes, there are, of course, more concepts than we have here in K-6. And some of these are going to be, in fact, studied when students get to high school. So they're in the secondary part of the new curriculum, which is great to see. But if primary teachers feel that they'd like to look at those concepts, of course, they're quite entitled to do that. What they're doing effectively is giving students a soft introduction to a concept that will be studied more carefully in later years. And while those concepts that aren't actually listed for study in K-6 should not probably be the focus of study, there's nothing wrong with teachers touching on those concepts, at least within the units which they write.
Because some of them are glaringly obvious. For example, this book that I do in Kinder in Year 1, often, the first thing that students notice on this page are the 3 little pigs in the sky.
Yeah. Yes,
So it's intertextual, but it's a kindergarten text, and intertextuality doesn't come along till stage 4. But that doesn't mean we can't, well, students are going to notice those whether we teach them or not, and we can talk about them.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. And look, another thing too is that you'll notice that Nessa has linked some concepts together. So perspective and context have been linked together, and argument and authority. And there kind of seems a certain logic to that. There seems to be a really strong connection between those concepts. But in actual fact, if you think about it, lots of texts can have authority, not just argumentative texts. And I think that kind of demonstrates that, you know, you can look at authority as separate to argument, and in fact, look at argument as separate to authority, and so on. They don't always need to be paired together.
But they can be, can't they?
They certainly can be.
For example, this text in one of our stage 3 units, Michael, it
Yep.
has authority,
Yes.
but it's contestable authority, clearly.
Yep.
And we teach this based on the authority in terms of there are lots of things. There are star charts in the text. There are journals from the 1800s in the text as authoritative sources. There are artworks, there's geographical structures, lots of things that give this text authority, but it's contestable, as it often is, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, so I think that's an important point that you just said. Just because a concept is not in a particular stage that you're teaching, it still may be in a book that you're reading, and students will either pick that up or you might explicitly show them that and teach them that. You might not call it intertextuality in kindy, of course, but you might point out that sometimes there are stories within stories. Yeah. And sometimes that's how composers get great ideas, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lorri, I think just on that point, it is actually good to introduce kids to the terminology for concepts. If they can start giving them a name, it's easier to actually to identify them when they come across these concepts in texts that they're studying.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Good. So let's have a look what else we've got here. So that's what's in the syllabus in terms of the textual concepts. And we've talked about where to find them. It's in the final outcome. And the final outcome is understanding and responding to literature. And that's a newbie. And that's an easy one to find. And it's all there for us, which is great. So this text, this book, where did this come from, Michael?
Well, this book, which is now no longer a book, it's now been converted to a website. So you can get everything, as you can see, from that website that's on that page there. This is actually freely available to all teachers, I'm very pleased to say. And it's been really the authoritative source for the new syllabus in terms of identifying the concepts, because all 15 English textual concepts that are identified in this book have actually been represented in the syllabus. Some of them you don't actually get to until you get to 7 to 10, but in fact all 15 are there. It came about through work between the Department of Education and the New South Wales English Teachers Association. And I was actually there in those early days when the whole idea of the thing was being discussed. And then finally it was published in 2017, as I said, in a booklet format, and eventually it went onto a website. This was a huge breakthrough because not only did it give us concepts for the first time in English and filled a gap in the 2012 syllabus, but it also showed us what the concepts looked at in different stages of kids' learning. So Lorri's showing an example of a page from the book there that shows the different stages in learning. And it also mapped the concepts to the New South Wales English syllabus. Well, that was important for the old 2012 syllabus that didn't specify concepts to be studied. But now, of course, the new syllabus does specify the concepts that need to be studied. So the mapping, of course, is no longer so significant, certainly for primary teachers that are now all embarking on the new syllabus when they start by next year.
And if you're doing this with your staff at school, it's really useful to look at that scope and sequence, isn't it?
It is.
Something that I always think is interesting as a K-6 teacher, why does it start at the top, Michael, and go down? We used it the other way.
Yeah, well, in fact, that's the way the syllabus was developed too, isn't it? From kindergarten through to year 10 that way. And that makes a lot of sense, that process for developing syllabus. So, look, all I can say is that English textual concepts have been used widely in stage 6 English, and in a way they've kind of filtered down through the stages in that way. So all I can say is there's an historical reason perhaps for the arrangement with year 12 down.
And my point from my end of the scope and sequence is that it started in secondary and it's come down to primary. So it's relatively new knowledge for primary teachers, whereas most secondary teachers are very well familiar with this work.
Yeah, you'd be surprised, Lorri. A lot are, and some are still coming to it for the first time now with this new syllabus. But the fact is, now that it's there in the syllabus, everybody needs to come to terms with this approach.
That's great. Now, let's unpack the 15 concepts a little bit, Michael. What do you think? I think we're up to that.
For sure, yes. Yes, it's
That's
a big
list.
15 concepts and a lot to get our head around.
So they're pretty straightforward, the list, but let's have a look at some of them specifically. I know that in kindergarten, we talk about character and narrative. Most texts that we start with are narrative and character texts, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be using informative texts in the early years. We should be, but the textual concepts are clear there.
Yeah.
Any other comments about textual concepts in the early years?
Yeah, look, I mean, some of them are very straightforward. Style, for example, which isn't actually there for study in K-6, but of course teachers can touch on it, as we mentioned before. Can refer to the style of a particular composer, someone like Anthony Brown or Sean Tan, who have very characteristic styles in their approach to books and illustrating. And also we can look at the style of particular periods, such as bush ballads, which is a genre that predominated in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Australia. And look, we've developed units of work, Lorri, haven't we, on character and narrative for all stages.
We have.
From your units, I Am Unique and Important for kindergarten, and how characters see their world for years 3 and 6. And then my unit, the wildness of stories for years 5 and 6. So just demonstrates that these concepts, in fact, do work across the different stages of kids' learning.
But it's interesting, Michael, based on what you just said about theme, because theme is actually a textual concept.
Yes, look, it's the big idea of theme rather than a particular theme. That's the point here. So yes, the big idea of theme, the idea that texts, present big ideas, and a lot of the text is geared around how effectively the composer can represent those ideas within the text. that's very much the focus of conceptual study. But which particular concept we're studying is almost a bit irrelevant in English. It's more about the process of presenting the themes. So I think actually the concept of representation always needs to go with the concept of theme.
And the example that you said about rainforests,
yep,
as a topic, in
yes,
terms of teachers that are programming in topics, what is the theme if you're looking at rainforests generally?
Well, look, you could, of course, look at texts that have something to say about the rainforest, or you could make it more general. That could be texts about the environment. But what you're looking at, in fact, is how texts represent environment. That's really the focus of the study, and that could range from how texts present the environment in a factual way in non-fiction texts to, for example, how the environment is used as the setting of a story in a narrative. So you can actually look at that concept across a range of texts.
I'd like to say something about context. I'm looking at context in depth now based on the unit that I'm writing.
Yeah.
And this book is set in a country town, and the characters in it have certain opinions and views and morals and ethics based on their context, which is interesting. And the author grew up in a country town too, so there's an authorial context there as well, which is fairly interesting. But because not all of Australia live in a country town, do they? Most people live in the cities like you do, Michael. So we decided to add some multicultural text to that when we're looking at context, to include cultural context, which is important as well.
Yeah.
And then there's another cultural context, but also we've got historical context in Australia as well that we're looking at. So there are a number of different ways of looking at context as well.
Yeah, look at
English work.
Concepts, and it's all the way through the syllabus. So obviously it's going to get a Guernsey as a concept for study. And look, I'd like to think that that the concept of argument, in fact, will be familiar to primary teachers too, Lorri, because we've been doing work on persuasion for ages now. Obviously because of NAPLAN and the focus on kids being able to write persuasive texts in years 3 and 5 NAPLAN. But in fact, persuasion is really just another term for argument. And if we position it not just as a way to teach kids about how to write a persuasive text, but look more broadly at this concept of argument and look at it through a whole range of texts, not just written text, but spoken text, visual, multimodal text, things like posters and TV advertising and whatever, this is going to actually make a much more interesting study of the concept than simply practicing writing for a standardized test.
And I like for students to go through a text and identify the language choices of the composer that sets up the argument. Yeah, it's a very good thing to do.
Sure, yeah.
Which gets into that grammar area as well, which is important.
Yeah.
What about code and convention?
Look, yeah, I think code and convention again will be one familiar to primary teachers. So really, it's about the patterns in written, spoken, visual, multimodal language that are used to express meaning, and how codes and conventions can become cues for readers and listeners and viewers so that they can understand text, because these are the things that we expect to find in text, the certain patterns which they follow.
I know you're doing some work with code and convention with this text, Michael, at the moment.
Yes, that's right. I'm attempting to write a stage 2 unit of work based on the new syllabus using the word spy as a key text. It's a terrific text because it draws attention to the codes and conventions around phonics, grammar, spelling, punctuation, and has a lot of fun with that, which is great. But in itself, of course, it's a non-fiction text that actually breaks a lot of the conventions about non-fiction texts, because it's such a personal text. It's got such a strong personal voice, and it actually makes a very direct address to the reader and engages the reader through the text in a way that you don't often expect to find in non-fiction texts.
Hallelujah, Michael, that you're using a non-fiction text in English in K6. Fantastic. Exactly. We're looking forward to that unit when it's finished. I'll be on it.
Right, myself.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good, because we need more informative texts.
We do.
K to 6 area. I think we're limiting
Yep.
ourselves in that way, and we're not exposing students to beautiful books about nature and animals and all the things that they love, and grammar and words, all of those things.
I think actually,
pardon.
Say, Lorri, that of all the concepts that we study in primary, I do think representation is the broadest one of all. It's really about the way composers represent people, events, and ideas in text in particular ways, using different modes and media and different forms and aspects of language. And I think that is really quite all-encompassing. I mean, if you think about it, what is characterization? Characterization is simply the representation of people in narrative texts, and so on. So many of the concepts actually can be seen to actually fit beneath that broad umbrella of the concept of representation.
And some of the textual concepts in this list are more familiar to primary teachers than other ones. And we've talked about intertextuality, how stories are within stories, which is really just looks at the interconnections between texts, Michael, explicit or sometimes implicit. And I know a text that we did, one of the first ones we did together, that I have here somewhere, about Mechanica.
Ah, yes.
What books does that link to, Michael?
What concepts you mean?
No, what books are within that text in terms of intertextuality?
In terms of intertextuality, The Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin. Nothing less than
fairly profound, isn't it?
A profound text, and yet you'd be ignoring, I guess, the depth and range of this text if you didn't actually draw attention to that intertextuality.
And then there are links to history, aren't there, as well, and links to science.
Exactly, yeah.
As well, when you look at that, which
so
is
it's certainly got aspects of genre to it, because it's got elements of scientific writing and language that are used deliberately by the writer, even though it's a lot of it's actually invented and done very playfully and imaginatively. So it does have elements of genre to it, and it's also a very particular genre, which is science fiction. So it looks at it's part of a family of texts that look at the future and get us to think about the kind of future that we might be preparing for. Not to say that this will be the future, of course, but it's just warning us that if we keep going the way we are with the destruction of our environment and the loss of species, that we could end up with a world like the one in Mechanica, which is quite a sort of a confronting idea, but one I think which kids in the later years of primary school are certainly ready to take on board.
Well, they're seeing evidence of climate change in their everyday life now, aren't they? So it makes it particularly important. But inside my Mechanica, I've written myself a little note to talk to teachers about when I'm doing courses, and it is about, this is a dystopian picture book for older readers.
Yeah.
It is a possible future, but certainly not a preferred one. And I thought they were famous words related to that text, that we need to say that every time we do it. And I have to remind myself that it's fiction, Michael. It's just such a serious topic. And the unit is so serious and engrossing and engaging when we talk about artificial intelligence. And there was a thing on the news this week that made me think about our unit, about in America, they're doing a trial of driverless cars, and people are putting cones on cars to confuse the driverless cars. So there's all these traffic jams because cars just stop. They don't know what to do. But all of those things we touched on in our unit. And it's so important that kids are talking about those things because they're part of their world increasingly every day.
Yeah, no, it's certainly an exciting unit. But Lorri, we've also made history the focus of some of our units as well. So it's going the other direction in time. So you wrote a unit on history's hidden truths.
Yes, I haven't got the book here for that yet.
Do you want to tell us about the concept behind?
I think it was representation and code and convention were our two main ones. I don't have the unit or the book with me, but the novella is by Bruce Pascoe and it's called Mrs. Whitlam. And I wrote it in conjunction with our Aboriginal education team at Adamstown when I was working there.
Yes.
It was really important because we had a group of couple of teachers school-based, and Aboriginal education team from regional office and myself as curriculum advisor would come together every Friday morning for a term to write this unit on these group of texts that we'd chosen. And we argued strongly what the concepts looked like throughout that unit. And I don't think I wanted to call it History's Hidden Truths, but that's what the group decided. We decided collaboratively to call it on that. And I think now, what a great name.
Yeah.
In terms of the things we wanted our kids to know that they don't know, and we included all of that knowledge in that unit. Yeah, it was very powerful learning. And what about this one, Michael, that you did? Tell me about this in terms of historical perspective.
K2 unit that I wrote for during the COVID, and it's a wonderful book about a boy who goes on a journey to Sydney during the Great Depression, and he goes to see the opening of the Harbour Bridge, travels alone on horse, all the way from country Victoria to Sydney and back again. So it's actually based on a true story. So it's a great example of historical fiction, but it's also a study of theme and how themes are represented, because it's looking at themes like overcoming adversity, which was a very strong theme, of course, of life back in the Great Depression, which absolutely resonates with young people that were and have been recently living through the whole COVID pandemic.
Yeah, very important. There's a couple of profound things that when I help teachers teach these this particular unit in schools that I wanted to share now with our listeners. First of all, things like code and convention story maps.
Yeah.
It's done beautifully there. And here you can see there's an historical context here. What happened in the late 1930s when Sydney Harbour Bridge was being built? We had Bradman, we had Farla, we had the bridge being built, all of those things. Yeah. That's a beautiful little story map there to extrapolate on. But recently, Michael and I taught a course together, and I just picked up this book to tell people about what kids found interesting in the text. There were two things in this text. One about the Susso camps, when you couldn't pay your rent. There was reference to what happened, I don't know, somewhere in the book there must have been, because the conversation happened about Susso camps. It was post-COVID, about when you can't pay your rent, somebody comes, you put all your stuff on the street, and then you have to go and live outside the town in the bush in a camp. Well, the students found that fascinating, just that whole idea of the depression in terms of the context of this text. But also there was one little girl in stage 2 that wasn't writing when I started working in the classroom at the beginning of the term. And we got to this page. Each night, Lenny fell into a deep, bone-weary sleep. And a few weeks into the classroom, she wrote a story, and she actually used that sentence in the story. So in terms of authoritative sources, quality texts are great models for students for their writing. It was very powerful learning. Yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Lorri, for sharing that.
Yeah. So, Michael, I always get, sometimes I get confused now. It used to be always, now it's sometimes, thanks to your input, between these two, perspective and point of view. Can you please explain the difference for everybody on camera?
Look, in ordinary parlance, of course, they are just interchangeable. So it can cause some confusion, but in the context of concepts, English concepts, they've been given absolutely quite separate and different meanings. So perspective is simply referring to the ways of thinking that people bring to text. So the composer brings particular ways of thinking, obviously, to the text that they create, but the audience also brings a range of different ways of thinking to text, and both contribute, of course, to the making of meaning within the text. So perspective is about ways of thinking outside of the text. Point of view is a device that's used within the text as a way to present ideas. Particularly, I mean, a very good example of that in a narrative text is the use of a first-person narrator, where the composer chooses a character from the story and tells the story from the point of view of that character. And there are other ways of viewing point of view as well, but they always involve a device that's used within the text itself.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's something that we have to remind ourselves of when we're looking at those two textual concepts.
For sure,
really important. So we've given an overview of all of these 15 textual concepts, Michael, today, which is a great thing to do. But we still advise that you read through the text, read through the book yourself, so you've got your own authoritative source to refer to about textual concepts, which is important. Or even better than that, do it with your whole staff. So you do it together, discussing the textual concepts. When I was teaching in Queanbeyan, I worked with a beautiful woman called Sue, who was the reading recovery teacher, and we get a new book and we had all the textual concepts up on the wall of our office. And as soon as we got the book, we'd go and stand next to the textual concepts chart and argue about which textual concepts were evident in that text. And one day someone in the office said, would you two stop arguing? And I turned around and I said, we are creating new knowledge. We're not arguing.
Good on
So
you.
that's what you need to do in schools, isn't it?
Exactly. What we want them to be doing in school, to having these rich discussions around texts and concepts. And we feel this is going to bring not just learning benefits, but also great excitement for teachers in their teaching of English as a subject.
That's right. So have you got any advice for us about when we're using textual concepts?
Yes, look, I think we need to think of concepts not as being separate entities, but as in fact related to each other. So if we just look at the next slide, Lorri, you can see there I've developed a model which is about how when we communicate, it always involves the composer communicating through a text to an audience. And you can see that where do the concepts sit? Well, some of them sit very firmly with the composer and the audience, like context and perspective and authority. And others sit with just one or the other, like literary value, for example, sits very much with the audience. Style sits very much with the composer. I don't have it listed there, but that sits with the composer as well.
I just wanted to give an example of literary value. We didn't give that example earlier, written in 1896.
Yes.
You can still buy it.
Exactly. I mean, literary value raises that whole question about what makes a classic, what makes an enduring text that, of course, still has value, even though it was written some time ago. And that's a sort of an obvious example of that one. A lot of the concepts actually sit within the text itself, don't they? So this is where representation is the umbrella, I think, for a whole range of other concepts which you can look at. Genre, and of those we look at narrative in particular, and character as a subset of narrative. And argument is another example of genre, which we look at in looking at different kinds of texts. Code and convention will come up in any kind of text, of course, because all texts involve use of these patterns that we talked about before. Imagery, symbol, and connotation in usually in poetry, but in a range of texts that use these poetic kinds of phrases. Yep. Point of view within text as well, as we mentioned before, whereas perspective sits outside the text. And we talk about the style of the text, the theme of the text, and the authority of a text itself. And thinking about how students can give authority to their own text is something important to do. And the one that sits outside, of course, is intertextuality, the idea that each text, of course, always connects with other texts that have gone before it. And whether the composer of a text does this deliberately or whether there are just connections that we can identify as readers and viewers of the text, I think that still makes it a very legitimate concept to look at.
And I think that's related to brain-based learning, isn't it? We have an idea and we build on an idea we already know in terms of chunking learning.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're conscious that we've heard a story, or we might write a story that's related to another story that we heard years ago, but we don't even realize that we're using intertextuality when we're writing. And authors say they do that all the time as well, don't they?
Exactly. So look, my point is, Lorri, that, you know, it's good when we write a unit of work just to focus on one or two concepts and to make that the focus of study. I think if you try and do more than that, it's going to get a little bit unwieldy. Kids are going to get confused and you're going to lose that focus as a teacher. But inevitably, in looking at those one or two concepts, you're going to be touching on others because these concepts are not separate entities. They are, in fact, interrelated.
And I'm glad you said that, because the text that I'm writing, I'm writing at the moment, I'm focusing on context. Intertextuality is there as well, but I can't ignore character because the characters are so rich and they add to the context of the text.
No, I agree.
That narrative and character has to happen as well, but students would have been doing that in early stage one, stage two, and this is stage 3. So they're going down, down, down at a deeper level, aren't they?
Yeah.
As they revisit those textual concepts they've already done before.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is important. So we move on. I really love the way that you've designed that, Michael, and given it deep thought, haven't you? How they relate to each other. Yeah. So you know that I'm a researcher and I'm a stickler for research. So what can you tell me about, what is this based on? Show me the money.
Okay, so Lorri, this slide outlines some of the important research and thinking behind the concept-based approach. Bloom's taxonomy, of course, has been around now for over 60 years, but it's been revised since then by Anderson and Krathwohl. What hasn't fundamentally changed, however, is Bloom's criticism that too much time in teaching is actually spent on lower order thinking, such as learning facts and decoding. Indeed, all students benefit by more attention being given to the higher orders of thinking, such as analysing, evaluating, and creating. So using concepts in our teaching helps to keep the focus on these higher orders of thinking.
The case for dialogic teaching.
For sure.
Deep discussion about quality texts.
Yep.
So I'd just like to add about the Newman research, the second point. So the authentic pedagogy studies by Newman and others is well over 30 years of research, which resulted in the quality teaching model that was introduced in the New South Wales Department in 2003, which is interesting about the importance of intellectual quality in teaching, which is a continuation of the point that you just made before.
Yeah.
What about Dylan Williams' work? I know you've been doing some work with him in your school.
Yes, that's true. Look, he stresses the idea that subject-specific concepts promote powerful ways of thinking. And he says, and I quote, "One of the key steps in designing a curriculum is to be clear about what the big ideas for the subject are."
That's important. So the research suggests that concepts are definitely the way to go. I wonder if we could wrap up now by considering why concepts are important for English teaching.
Look, well, first and foremost for me, Lorri, is that focusing on concepts ensures intellectual quality of learning, challenging students at an appropriate level.
I'll just stop sharing because we've finished our slides now, haven't we?
Yeah.
But it also allows teachers to more fully implement the English syllabus with its strong focus on quality literature, particularly for more sophisticated objectives. We don't have objectives in the new syllabus, but they're still there. They're embedded. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, that was certainly the old syllabus. They were evident in objectives C and D, but now they're spelled out for us, aren't they? Which is great. And let's not forget that the new curriculum in New South Wales now requires this explicit focus on concepts. So teachers can't avoid it. It has to be done anyway.
But the thing that we emphasise together in our work is focusing on concepts ensures that teachers don't slip back in that old school model about thinking that English is just a set of literacy skills. It's so much more.
And look, I think this conceptual focus in the primary years also means that students will be well prepared for English in the secondary years. This creates continuity in their learning experience across the primary-secondary divide.
I agree. Yeah, that's so important, isn't it? And I know we've had a few secondary teachers at courses recently, and isn't there a rich focus on great conversations when primary and secondary teachers get together?
For sure, yeah.
So there needs to be more of that. But most important of all, Michael, is that by embracing the fullness of subject English, using the concept-based approach, we're creating more exciting learning opportunities for our students and our teachers.
Absolutely, Lorri. You and I have both had so much fun working with concepts. They enlighten and enrich our English programming and teaching.
Oh, yes, I totally agree. Look, it looks like we've reached the end of our time today. We should remind teachers that this podcast is available through our website, and I'll just get the slides back up again. So you can see our website. Here it is. On that same site, you can find our Peter paper, Let's Write a Unit, and recordings of 2 Peter webinars, which show how you can use concepts to produce quality units of work. You can also find many units that we've written together and separately that demonstrate the evidence that we practice what we preach, which is important. Bye, everyone, and thanks for joining us today.
Bye, and have fun working with concepts.